everyone, and welcome to the Aginext community. I'm Jen Riggins, and I help coordinate the Aginext community and our flagship event, Aginext. We have our event coming up, our second online after the last one went spontaneously online, March 17th to 19th. And actually, as our fourth as our fourth keynote speaker and our first to kick off the conference, we have Cornelia Davis. So do you want to start by introducing yourself and giving your tech journey?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, both on this interview as well as a part of the conference. I think when you reached out to me, the previous one hadn't gone remote yet, and this was intended to be in person. So I'm delighted to still be able to participate one way or the other. So yeah, so my name is Cornelia Davis. I am currently serving as the CTO at a company called Weaveworks. Weaveworks is a company that operates in the kind of cloud native space on Kubernetes and a number of other technologies like GitOps. In terms of my journey to technology, I'm one of these people who got super, super lucky. I had self-selected out, like a lot of high schoolers, especially high school girls. I had self-selected out of doing anything so geeky as computers. But I had signed up and tried to get out of, but signed up for a computer programming class, which you have to realize I've got a fair bit of gray hair. This was back in 1981. So I was super lucky to have that class available. And after dragging my feet for a few days, I finally showed up and I wrote the first 4-line program and it ran on the screen. It just counted on the screen. Sorry, let's turn that off. I was hooked. And so junior in high school, realized that I wanted to do this computing thing. Wasn't sure exactly what that meant, but I did a degree in computer science, started my career in aerospace a little over 20 years ago, transitioned over to commercial. Maybe 23 years ago, moved into the web space at the end 90s. And then for the last 10 years or so, have been working in this cloud space, the cloud native space. I was at Pivotal for quite some time. And then, like I said, about a year ago, moved over to Weaveworks.
Okay, so we put everyone on the same playing field because a lot of the Aginext community is more on the, I don't want to say softer side of tech, but the less technical. They may have, most have technical backgrounds, but have since moved on to coaching, managing roles, project management roles. What is cloud native and how does that relate with the cultural side of tech?
Yep, cool. So cloud native is, and I in fact wrote a book on cloud native. So I am an author of a book that I wrote with Manning called Cloud Native Patterns. Now it is definitely targeted at the techie, although the first 3 chapters are maybe more along the lines of what you're alluding to here. So the first 3 chapters actually set the stage of why. What is cloud native? Why do you care? And so to tell a little bit of a story, and by the way, I love this community because I'm a techie, but what I really, really love to do is take technology and really tie it to business value. And business value isn't technical. It's a business. You know, we want to solve problems with it. And so cloud native is this. 10, 15 years ago, when we started moving things into the cloud, people took their stuff that they were running in their data centers and they stuck it on the cloud, and they thought that it would be just fine. But what happens in the cloud is that everything is so distributed. So you're not just running in your own data center, you're running in Amazon, but if you're running in Amazon, you're running a little bit here and a little bit there. And even if you're running in Amazon, you're also running some stuff in the browser. And so everything is so hugely distributed and everything's always changing. Whether it is the infrastructure itself that's changing out from under your feet. So when Amazon switches out a server under the covers, you don't get to say, oh, no, don't change that server today because today is a really critical day for me. You don't have that option. So it's changing out from under your feet. And then many of you listening in and at the conference are going to know that the other change is that you're constantly releasing. You're always changing the software that you're putting on there. And so if you take this highly distributed and constant change, you just have to do things differently. And cloud native is this category that says, You have to build your software a certain way. You have to architect it a certain way. And that's what the latter half of my book is about. It's about those architectural patterns. It changes the way that you organize your IT organization. So you can no longer, if you want to release 3 times a day, you can't have change control doing a major, like, oh no, you can't make a change because it might break things. So you have to change your organizational structures, you have to change your policies, all of that stuff. And that's what cloud native means, is this whole bucket of things that you need to change because the technical infrastructure changed.
And so obviously one of the true values as Agile turns 20, like I think this month, is like releasing quickly, faster releases, faster feedback cycles. How does the cloud actually result, even though everything's distributed all over, how does the cloud result in faster feedback?
I think one of the main things that it brings you is the feedback actually is made faster because of all of the practices that you do. The fact that you can get it out there more frequently is the key to the faster feedback loops. But one of the main catalysts, one of the main reasons that the cloud has enabled these faster cycles is because everything has an API. You can get anything you need via an API call. You are not filing a ticket and waiting for somebody to provision a server. You can go to Amazon or Google or Microsoft Azure and you could say, you know what, I need a machine. And then more recently, in the last, say, 7, 8 years, where containers have really gotten much faster, or much more prevalent, the speeds have gotten even faster, because it used to be when you ask for a VM, it would take maybe 5 minutes for it to provision. Now, when you ask for something to run inside of a container, it can be spun up in less than a second. And so you have this ability to have these faster feedback loops. Now, there's a number of other elements, and in fact, my talk starts to touch upon one of those. So it's not just the API, but it's some of the practices that we employ around our deployments.
Which is a great segue. Thank you, Cornelia. Your talk is testing in production. Are you crazy? Why would you want to or not want to test in production? Obviously, it gives you more realistic experience, but can't more shit go wrong?
It can. And so that's one of the things that we mean about cloud native. So the reality is that one of the measures that people use to tie things to business value, and this is where the book Accelerate and the State of the DevOps report, this is where Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, Gene Kim had done this really tremendous work on tying together certain IT practices to high performing organizations. Now, the high performing organizations, the definition of that is tied directly to business metrics. It's things like increasing market share, profitability, and so on. And what they did was they did some data science to find the things that correlated. Now, correlation, Nicole will be the first to say correlation is not the same as causation, but we as an industry have been able to take that correlation and then in fact show that there's some causation as well. And so one of those metrics, there's 4 metrics that they've identified as being really tied very closely to these high performing organizations. And one of those is how frequently do you deploy? And so if you, another one, by the way, is time from idea to production. So it's time from code complete to having it running in production. Now, if you have to go through a rigorous testing process before you go out into production, then you really can't release 5 times a day, because each one of those release cycles, you'd have to go into your testing environment, you'd have to do some testing, you'd have to do some integration testing and so on. And even if you start those tests, if you want to do 5 releases, let's just take a 10-hour day, just for easy math. That means every 2 hours you're releasing. Well, you can say, all right, I'm going to send this out to the test environment. It's going to take half an hour to run the integration tests. I'll start working on the next feature that I want to push out. And then something goes wrong in the integration test. So now you have to go back. And so by the time you start working through that, it's extraordinarily complex. Now, mind you, I'm not suggesting that you don't do some level of testing before you go to production. But like you said, number one, you're never going to have a test environment that is going to ensure that you don't have anything go wrong in production. And so if you just change your mindset from, you know what, rather than trying to prevent anything from happening in production, I'm going to put the fail safes in there so that if something starts to go wrong, I can pull back. That changes everything. So now you can do a 5-minute unit test. Try something in production. You don't even have to try it with everyone. You can try it with a teeny tiny little bit. You can try it in production, and I'll talk about some of these patterns like progressive delivery patterns and things like that. So it's safety nets that really enable you to test in production, and that's what I'll be talking about.
And that was James Governor was actually one of the keynotes of last year's conference. So he gave us a baseline introduction to progressive delivery, which
Yep.
in a nutshell is doing things to control your blast radius. So you're not exploding everyone at the same time. Maybe you were testing things on the people that have the stolen credit cards that signed up for your tool or something like that, or A/B testing and concepts that business understands too. And we'll definitely include in the notes on this talk, I'll include a link to the DORA metrics, I think is what you're referring to with the cloud
Yep, exactly.
for all those, the FANG businesses, the businesses that are exceedingly successful and they've come out of Google and DevOps, the State of DevOps report, things like that. There has to be a cultural change though, because if you are going to say test in production, again, you even admitted in your title, are you crazy? There have to be people that push back. Are there certain people on a normal, I guess, enterprise, but also it can be a smaller organization too, that need to be involved in this buy-in, and how do you persuade them?
Yeah, I mean, at the top of my list, the people who need to be involved in making the changes are the people who tend to be and I don't mean this nearly as negative as it's going to sound, but the people who are accused of being the departments of no in the past. So it's like the security
Compliance,
folks,
security.
compliance, security, and change control. So the change control folks are ultimately responsible for if something does go upside down in prod. You know, it's the Super Bowl and your pizza ordering website goes down. It's the change control people who have historically been on the hook for that. It's like it's your job to keep bad things from happening in production. And so those are really the functions that need to be involved. Now, the interesting thing is that initially in a large enterprise, you're going to have those functions and you're going to need to help them make those transformations. Moving forward, rather than having somebody who's in charge of change control, what you are going to have is you're going to have a platform team that's responsible for providing the safety nets so that the application teams have what they need to be able to do these things, to be more agile, and to be more agile, not just in the development process, but agile all the way out to the production deployment process. And so some of those roles may in fact go away. Kind of downstream from that, those are kind of the first ones that come to mind, but it has these cascading consequences as well, in that you're going to change the way that you do quality assurance. Quality assurance tended to be something that, okay, we in dev are code complete, now we're going to throw over the wall to quality assurance and they're going to do their jobs. What we need to do is, if we're releasing 5 times a day, we're not throwing things over the wall 5 times a day. What we've done is we've taken what used to be a separate QA group and we've integrated those people with those skill sets into the engineering teams. And they've assisted in setting up the scaffolding, making sure that you are writing your tests in the right way, that you've got proper test code coverage, that you as a developer have the ability to achieve that test coverage. And you put those triggers in place that say, well, you can't release this into production because you've slipped below some budget. You no longer have enough code coverage, so you can't deploy into production anymore. So there's a whole host of things that change: practices, organizational structures, everything.
I guess this isn't a light switch where you're like, we're going to start testing in prod one day. Are there certain parts of the code base or certain teams where you tend to try it with, maybe greenfield apps, or where does it normally begin? Who inspires the test in production?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely some architectural requirements to being able to test in production. So you, for example, it tends to work better with things that are less monolithic. You almost have to have an API in front. So I'm starting to allude to things like microservices. And then one of the most essential things is observability. You've got to have observability so that you can tool up metrics. It isn't a judgment anymore, and it isn't a manual test. You've got metrics that you can tie into the safety nets so that it's at the first sign of trouble, you aren't depending on a human being to pull back. You're depending on some automated robot to say, oh, wait, these numbers aren't looking good. I'm going to pull back. Now, the other important pattern is that one of my favorite things is when we talk about progressive delivery, we often talk about take 5% of your traffic. And as you had said, you can partition along a number of different axes, different people, different times of day, things like that. But one of the most effective patterns is you don't have any return traffic coming from the new version. What you do is you have something in there that forks the incoming request, and all of it still goes, 100% of it still goes to version 1, and 100% of the responses are coming from version 1, but you've forked it and you're now sending some of the requests over to version 2, where you're just looking at how things are going there. So you've kind of doubled up, where that gives you a way of testing without affecting it, not 100%, because you're probably doing it on the same infrastructure. So there's a chance that it may, you haven't limited the blast radius enough, but you've further constrained the blast radius so that, in fact, no V2 responses are going back to any of your users. So there's all sorts of cool patterns like that.
Where do coaches come involved in here? Because there is a cultural change. What are the
Yeah.
questions that need to be asked to figure out if people are ready for this or to persuade them?
So that's a super question. And I think that from a coaching perspective, I mean, one of the first things is um, a signal to look for as a coach, as somebody who's coming in to assess whether an organization is ready for something like this, is how frequently you hear the refrain of, well, this is the way we do things. We've always done it this way. Or the ITIL book says. I have often, when I'm talking with customers early on, will ask the question of, well, why do you do things that way? And if the answer is, well, because that's the way we've always done it, or hey, why are you doing perimeter configuration? Well, because the way that we set up the firewall is, it's like, no, you just told me exactly, you told me the mechanisms that you're using. You've lost sight of what the requirements are that are driving that. And so I guess, to answer your question, one of the first places that coaches can help is to help individuals get back to what are the requirements for the practices, because sometimes those practices have been in place for decades. And so helping them understand what are the requirements that you're addressing with those practices, and how can we satisfy those requirements through some other means, I think that's one of the first things.
And then sometimes it's probably rare, but it might make sense to stay with the monolith in part of the code, or stay with whatever is actually working for a valid reason.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, there's no requirement. And there are, I spend a fair bit of time in the DevOps enterprise community, so Gene Kim's conference. And one of the people who is there very, very frequently, pretty much speaks at every event, is Rosalind Radcliffe from IBM. She has spent her entire career in Z systems, in mainframes. And she talks about being able to do some of these things, even in a Z system setting, even in a mainframe setting. And so now we're talking about, DevOps in kind of a broader setting. And there are ways that you can start to apply some of those practices and principles. It is easier as the architectures, and that's really what cloud native starts to do, is it starts to say, well, there's also architectural patterns that make these things easier.
Mhm. And then I'm just asking everyone, because I think all of our speakers, when I talk to them, what's the best part of your job? And I think also when you're talking about a CTO, obviously we also talked to Mary Williams, who's another CTO, but I feel like that's a very varied job. It's a big job. It's a big job.
Yeah.
But what's the best part of your job? What's your favorite part?
My favorite part is that it's never the same thing. I mean, literally every day it is something new. And I sometimes say that my first title right now, my work title is CTO, but even before that, my title is change junkie. And so I get my fix every day, literally. And I mean, emerging tech is just so fabulous. And I've worked in the emerging tech. I've been fortunate that I've worked in emerging tech my whole career. And I mean, gosh, look at what has happened in the last. We've had this massive shift from what was kind of a 30-year tech stack into the cloud, and there's always something new. And so that's my favorite part. And what that means is that it's not just that I'm sitting in my basement and get to play with new tech all the time. I get to co-invent with not only my colleagues at my current job, but my industry colleagues. And so that is my favorite part of the job.